In association with BizNews, welcome to Mags on Media. In this week's episode, navigating the complex web of public health messaging, we're going to take a look at the role that media has played in COVID-19 communication, and anything is possible with Investec's brand new campaign. I want to start with this, though. South Africa's media landscape is shaped by a digital divide, making the production and dissemination of effective public health campaigns a real challenge. Talking to me now, Chris Vick, chairperson of the COVID Comms, a network of communication specialists aiming to spread accurate information from credible sources on the COVID-19 pandemic. And credible sources, I think, is a key phrase in this conversation. Chris, what is COVID Comms aiming to do for public health messaging that government isn't doing?
Well, we came together because of a concern that government's communication was in scientific language, primarily in English, and primarily targeted at urban areas. So our objective has been to pull together a range of creative people who can produce easy to understand public health information in the form of infographics, videos, or radio clips in all 11 South African languages. We've even done work in Khoi to make sure maximum impact is achieved. And it's sort of taking science and making it easy to understand. So we deconstruct that scientific language and focus on using all South African languages. That is our core purpose.
With what intention? What's the key message that you're trying to put across?
Well, the key message is aligned to what government says. It's aligned to what the World Health Organization and other health authorities say. The first 9 months to a year of our existence, because we were formed the day of the national lockdown, the focus was primarily on preventing the spread of COVID-19, so preventative measures, wearing masks, washing hands, etc. And then when the vaccines arrived and the rollout started, we then started to focus on additional messaging around the importance of vaccines, explaining how they work through easy-to-understand videos, etc. And then also introducing the importance of ventilation, because scientists have found that's also a critical issue in terms of preventing the spread of COVID-19. So very much aligned with what government's doing, just packaged very differently. As I say, multiple languages, plain language, deconstructing the science.
As we speak, the world is now dealing with the new variant. How is your approach and messaging changing then?
Well, it is complex, right? Because there's still there are a lot of unknowns around the new variant. For example, whether vaccines are still as efficient as they were with the previous variants. So, I mean, we have daily meetings with people in the Department of Health, the NICD, and other people working on these issues to tweak. But, I mean, the messaging stays the same in that preventative non-pharmaceutical approaches, mask, sanitation, and social distancing, alongside ventilation, apply with whatever variant comes out. It's affected to some extent the vaccine messaging, as I say, because of the uncertainty around the variant. But the science that we've seen and the discussions we've had with the medical practitioners and scientists is that vaccination will help to manage the impact of this variant and others that may come along. But I must say, I mean, it's a sort of daily journey to find out what new has been discovered, but keeping that kind of bedrock of consistent messaging, and particularly dealing with people who are hesitant around getting vaccinated. There are people who are outright resistant, where we've had very little success, but with people who are hesitant, the response is incredibly good. I think the new variant has actually resulted in an slight increase in vaccinations, possibly because it's smashed through the complacency that was starting to develop around COVID-19. But for us, it's a combination of this new variant and the reality of the so-called festive season, which is that a lot of people travel, a lot of people have large gatherings, a lot of time is spent in public transport. So the more we can bed down that sort of combination of non-pharmaceutical interventions and vaccination messaging, the more impact we're hoping to have.
Chris Vick, as a communications professional, how difficult is it to move away from the constant and increasing volume of misinformation? And again, I refer you to the new variant and the way in which it's been labeled the South African variant, which has led to all sorts of obvious consequences. How do we get over that, I wonder?
Well, I mean, it is a constant battle of fact versus fiction. And when the facts are uncertain, it's very difficult to combat the fiction. But I mean, for example, COVID comms, we've launched a series of workshops. We've done about 50 so far, aimed primarily at young people who are vaccine hesitant. And what we find is if you listen to the reasons that people put forward and you respond to those in a conversational way, in an engaging way, that we are able to influence perceptions. I mean, we often find people going straight from a workshop that we convene to go and get vaccinated. But I think it happens on different levels. You know, I think within communities and whether they're geographic or faith-based or whatever, I think that the conversations happening between communities are very different to the conversations that are happening geographically between South Africa and Europe or the US, for example. So, you know, it's happening on different levels, and it's a bit of a cliche, but there are many moving parts involved in this thing. For us, the importance is consistency in the messaging. And as I said, to listen to why people have particular concerns, and then to respond to them in a fact-based way and in language that people can understand.
What amplified or better way can the business community get involved with initiatives like this?
Well, B4SA, which was set up by BUSA and other elements of organized business, has played an incredibly important role across the board. I mean, whether it's with logistics around vaccines or around understanding, you know, the economic impact of the lockdowns. But when it comes to communications, and B4SA, has a very dedicated team, which is part of a formation we're involved in called the National Communications Partnership. Now that brings together business, labor, civil society, and government. And there's constant discussion around what business is doing, what business can do, and how that can be aligned with the efforts of government, labor, and civil society. So I would say from a sort of institutional point of view, organized business has been incredibly helpful and very, very supportive. And then also taking messages back to particular sectors of business, such as mining, the retail sector. There's a lot of movement of information and ideas that's going on. And it really has helped this national effort around COVID-19.
When you talk about messaging, I understand that it's hard work, it's a slog, but as we approach the festive period, we've been in this situation for 2 years now. How do you combat pandemic messaging fatigue going forward? In other words, what is your plan for 2022?
Well, it is a real challenge, and I think that ironically, this new variant has dealt with some of that pandemic fatigue, and it's a bit morbid. But I think in reality, the more infections we see, and it's bound to happen, the more fatalities we see, and the greater the impact on the economy. That, in a way, pushes through the fatigue that exists already. But in the case of COVID comms, I mean, we're constantly coming up with new creative ideas. We launch new campaigns every 4 to 6 months. Our festive season messaging is very much aimed at young people because we believe they can act as vaccine ambassadors within their communities or within their constituencies. The message there is if you're going to joel outdoors, joel in small groups, be conscious of your behavior. There's also a specific set of messaging aimed at people who are using public transport around the importance of ventilation, wearing a mask, sanitizing, etc. So we sort of, the bedrock approach around messaging stays the same, but the tonality changes depending on the time of the year. The creative approach that we use changes depending on the time of the year and the target audience. So a lot of the material that's coming off the production line now is what we call live action. So we've got, for example, 2 people arriving at a bar, realizing that it's very crowded and they're likely to pick up an infection if there is something in the air, and then going to sit in an outdoor bar, which is much quieter and calmer, and then reinforcing the importance of vaccinations within that. So the creative approach changes, as I say, but the bedrock of messaging stays pretty much the same.
And Chris Vick, I say strength to your hand and to the initiative. It is important. Thank you for joining me. Seizing possibilities is the idea behind Investec's latest campaign. It's an optimistic message that is meant to set the company apart from other industry players. I'm going to talk now to Heather Casey, Investec's head of brand in South Africa. Okay, Heather, you mentioned that the new campaign stands out against, and I quote, the conventional themes associated with financial services planning. What are those conventional themes, and why are you going in a new direction?
Morning, Jeremy. Good to be here. It's less about standing out against conventional themes when it comes to the traditional type of financial services advertising, but more about, from our perspective, staying true to our roots as a brand. Leading up to this campaign, we spent a lot of time last year, as I know many companies did, whilst the world was in the grips of COVID, and tried to use the time well in looking at our positioning, making sure that it was relevant, solid, true, human, and I've mentioned the word relevant, but still relevant to the times that we live in, because they were changing dramatically. So our positioning has always been out of the ordinary. It is a benchmark that we hold ourselves to. It's our North Star, something we hold ourselves accountable to. And we really wanted to unpack it and look at it. Was it still relevant for the times we were living in? And then we distilled it down. We felt, well, it needed to be articulated in such a way that it's easily understood by our clients and potential clients. We constantly refer to the fact that we're a human partner, which quite simply means that we put our clients at the center of everything we do. And we spent the time last year just unpacking that and making sure that our positioning of out of the ordinary wasn't going to change, that it felt relevant for the times that we're living in. And so one of the questions we asked ourselves was, what does it mean then to be out of the ordinary in 2021? And the purpose of this campaign then was really to position that in a very simple way. We wanted a bold, a positive, a stimulating message, and a message that would stand out from the clutter, especially in the times that we were living in.
When you do something like this, a recalibration, Heather, how much risk is attached to it?
So let me clarify. In our minds, it's less of a recalibration, more of an emphasizing our positioning in a clear and simple way. I think if we had gone into really looking at changing it dramatically, there is risk in that, and I think there's brand risk. Especially if you've been in market for a very long time, like we have certainly in South Africa. And so there would be risk if you're changing a positioning that you're rooted in. Certainly for this campaign, we feel that it's rooted in our positioning, and we're articulating it in a very simple way, given the world that we were living in.
You spoke to me about being relevant for the time that we live in. That resonates with me very powerfully, given the enormous difficulties that we're facing. As I speak to you now, we're dealing with the new COVID variant. We've just come out of a very difficult climate change conference. We don't have time for me to list all the difficulties that the world is facing right now. But how can you be sure, Heather, that a campaign like this is not only going to be well received, but is going to find some resonance through the clutter?
Jeremy, we asked ourselves that exact question for a good few months. And I just want to acknowledge that we absolutely recognize that the events that have happened in the last 18 months have been devastating across the globe on an individual, an economic, and a global level. And that's certainly the last 18 months. It's been business unusual against that backdrop. So when we entered into really looking at how do we launch a campaign into market, we had that in top of mind. And I'm smiling to myself as we find ourselves this week again in the grips of a fourth wave and what we're facing, but still firmly believe that it was the right time for a particular message to go out. And the reason for that is we wanted to look forward. We wanted to play our part in rebuilding with a message of hope, sending a positive message and trying to look forward to a brighter tomorrow and a brighter future with a little bit of optimism. But again, as I clarify, absolutely acknowledging that the world has really been through turmoil. But we wanted to look forward with optimism, and that's why we felt the time was right. Businesses, individuals, our clients are really looking at the world differently. And this messaging into market now at this particular time was designed to make the most of this moment, to focus on the possibilities that lie ahead. It's so easy to get bogged down in what we are surrounded in, and as you mentioned, Jeremy, there are many issues we could spend all day talking about. But we felt we wanted to focus on the possibilities that lie ahead. We feel that as a company, we've always had this ability to look beyond the moment in time and focus on the future, and we felt the time was right to do that. We did question ourselves a lot in the last month as we raced to get all the assets done. We felt that it was a good time in November to launch. And I sit here with knowing what's going on around the world and still believe that it's the right time for focusing on a positive message.
You talk about brands having to bring hope and optimism. It's not just in the financial services space, but it's wherever you look. Do brands have any choice these days but to pivot in that direction, do you think?
In my opinion, Jeremy, I don't think if a brand wants to remain relevant, I think a brand needs to consider that. We speak a lot about, in the marketing world, about purpose-led brands. We know all the statistics and the figures that come out saying consumers globally really don't care if a brand is going to exist. I think 70% of consumers sometimes don't believe that, they don't really mind if a brand goes under. What a brand needs to focus on is really being purpose-led, is focusing on a message that's relevant for the time, and not being tone deaf to what's going around, in the globe at that time. So I believe that brands generally do have to pivot. Doesn't necessarily mean changing positioning. It really means focusing on consumers. What are the consumers saying? What do we need to be focusing on? And how do we make ourselves relevant?
Providing, of course, a brand lives the purpose and that you simply don't pay lip service to it.
Correct.
This has got to be inculcated into your entire ethos within the organization, doesn't it? That's perhaps more difficult to do. Yes,
it is very difficult. But at the same time, and I might sound as if it's a contradiction, it should be quite simple. If you have a positioning and a purpose that is strong and it's authentic and you believe it and you constantly ensure that it's relevant, it should be quite simple. And you need to, as I mentioned earlier, not be tone deaf to what's around you.
Just a final question then, Heather Casey. How do you measure the success of a campaign like this?
We obviously do all the statistics and the measurement and the analysis that everybody does. We look at annually doing research into the health of our brand, to look at what our clients are saying about us. We use all the traditional listening tools. We look at all the benchmarks, etc. But we also look at a lot of face-to-face feedback. We from a brand's point of view, brand has to do a particular job. Are we generating leads and driving business? Yes, we need to do that, and our businesses need to sort of leverage up and follow suit with messaging that talks to that. But we use all the tools, the listening tools, the stats, the measurements, the analysis, and at the end of the day, use feedback from clients and stakeholders to ensure that we are constantly on track.
Heather, thank you very much for joining us on Mags on Media.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.